So I'm going to ask you about when you first started working with Alexander McQueen, because the first time you really collaborated was a set of images for the Florence Biennale, which was 1996,
yes.
I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit, because they're a very interesting set of images, and I think that they're not that widely seen. You can't really find them online that much, and I don't know if people are that aware of them. And just tell me a little bit about the images themselves and the conversations.
Well, it came from, you're right, they're not widely available, partly because it's that sort of pre-internet, pre-digital era. And a lot of that stuff hasn't been digitized. And because they weren't for a magazine, they were for a Biennale, and they were big sort of 9-foot prints. So they were seen, of course, in the Biennale, but they weren't seen so much outside of it. It came out, we spoke about before that Lee and I obviously found each other and wanted to work together, and we'd approached him and said, let's do something. And we had something at the Barbican was coming up, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. I've been asked to do something for this Florence Biennale, so why don't we work on that together? So that's literally how they came about. He had something he had to do for Florence Biennale, and it was seemed to be a good way of starting a relationship.
And do you remember what kind of a brief, I don't know if he'd even have made you aware, they'd given him? Because it's quite a strange set of images in a sense, because some of them are kind of, a fashion image, but some of them are kind of portraits of him, and it's very much seems to be about his thought processes, less about his designs, perhaps.
I'd have to go back and check that Biennale, what its sort of underlying themes were. I got a feeling that they'd mixed lots of sort of fashion people and art people. So you might have Prada with Rimkel House or something like that. So there was that sort of fashion art mix, which seemed to be running all the way through it. So I guess it was that, quite where Lee and I fitted into that. Obviously Lee from the fashion, but then again, I'm from the fashion. It was a little of an odd mixture. I don't think that the Florence Biennale really had taken much depth. I think they contacted people and sort of let people sort them with their own partners out a bit. That's my impression of it.
And just from an image making perspective for you, because I find them quite interesting, because I think they're a real sign of when you were becoming interested in things like, post-production and kind of these strange, kind of quite like macabre special effects. And tell me about, just from your stages as a photographer, was that something that you were already playing with, particularly the head exploding image?
Yeah, it was. Well, it's the beginning of digital, so it's the beginning of the possibilities of digital. So the way you can combine two complete separate images and fuse them or melt them or bring them together, or sort of interlace them a little bit. So that's the beginning of a new way of working. That probably happened end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, that was starting to happen. So it was still very current and still very exciting, because the possibilities of actually taking two very disparate images and bringing them together. Artistically, it brings you into a lot of different territories that previously you couldn't really have imagined. With conventional photography, you can't really get two images. You can double print them, then you get that sort of ghosting thing. You could cut and collage and sort of collage them together, like physically cutting them and sticking them. You could airbrush sort of the join between two printing images. But it was all pretty lo-fi stuff, and fairly limited in the range of things you could do. And this was a way of blending things almost seamlessly together. So one of the images is, as you say, the exploding head, where Lee had the idea that he wanted his, to show the sort of, already at that stage, how he felt about working in fashion, which is sort of, the sort of frustration and kind of, energy and anger and all those sorts of things just bursting out of him. But another image that we did was of a girl called Carmen Hawke, who was a very trending model at that time. And it was a mixture of her and a doll. So I got one of my children's dolls, and we photographed Carmen, and she had a sort of plastic bodice on, see-through plastic bodice. And I remember Lee actually cutting it on her when she was wearing it. It's just molded plastic, but he got a pair of scissors and was sort of cutting it to fit her. And it's quite in that sort of Hans Bellmer obsession that he had. It was sort of the doll woman. And then we took that further in the post-production state by taking a kind of like a sort of little doll's face and blending that into her face. So she has plastic doll lips and sort of plastic doll cheeks, but her real eyes, and a plastic doll forehead with the kind of weird sort of pock mark or hole marks that the hair would join onto the skull with on a doll. So that blending those things together was it was at the beginning of all that digital stuff, which now we partly take for granted, but partly there wasn't so much a realization that you could do that. So people don't really understand.
Do you remember people's reactions? Did they kind of find it quite strange when you first started experimenting with it? Because a lot of photographers didn't make use of it.
No, but I think a lot of photographers are very much into the craft of photography, and this is the craft of image making. And it's a very different thing. It obeys different rules to the craft of photography. So I think a lot of photographers were very much wrapped up in the whole ideas of photography and sort of parameters and rules and laws, if you want, set by what is a photograph and what isn't. Whereas I'm not particularly bothered about that. So this was actually a whole set of new rules, a whole set of different things. I think it becomes a point where the public, for a long time, lose track of what image making is. So they still think it's about airbrushing, which is, nobody's really done airbrushing in
for ages,
since the 1970s. When I did some great airbrushing, but it's not something one does anymore, which is actually having a pen with a little sort of bubble of ink on top of it, and the pen has airbrush shot through it. So that's what airbrushing is. Of course, you never get a pen and ink anymore. It doesn't apply. And I think the public started to lose contact with how images are made at that point, because the idea that you can take two different things and bring them together, I think a lot of people reacted to that, and have continued to react to that, although I think it's slightly fading now, as the idea that's some sort of deceit.
Yeah, like images have to be truthful in some way.
Images have to be truthful, which comes from the sort of political images of the sort of, right from the sort of last half of the last century. We know, obviously there was lots of sort of, so-and-so was dropped in or painted out or whatever it is, and people were replaced or people were made to look different in a way of manipulating the truth purposely.
Yeah, it's very like Soviet.
There's a lot of, it sort of immediately flashes into my mind as sort of, Soviet lineups where people have been taken out and that sort of thing. So I think there was the idea that after you'd taken a photograph, you could fundamentally change it and change the relationship between everything within it. People treat it as some sort of manipulation, and by manipulation it's a negative word, and it sort of implies a sort of deceit and underhandedness, which is not at all the truth. I mean, any more than a painter might choose to paint something, he can choose to paint a range of objects in the same frame, and that's not a truth or a deceit or a manipulation.
Have you ever found any concern about that from your subjects? Because I imagine, like, it's interesting when you're talking about kind of with the model and kind of morphing her into a doll in some ways. Have you ever had that sometimes where people, because you have such license after you've taken the image to kind of turn them into...
Yeah, I haven't had much feedback from the people I've photographed or made images of and then changed afterwards. I remember at the same sort of time we photographed Sophie Dahl. Sophie Dahl at the time was very curvaceous, really very curvaceous. And I loved the fact that she was very curvaceous. And actually in post-production I made her even more curvaceous. So I made thighs that were this shape and thighs that were this shape, or boobs that were much bigger, and also disproportionate, so one boob was smaller, one boob was bigger. So I completely changed, as you would if you were a sculptor. I mean, imagine Henry Moore, you can imagine the distortion that an artist like that would bring to female form. And I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't do the same thing. And I think she was a bit upset that I made her more curvaceous.
Oh, that's interesting.
But that's, probably have to ask Sophie about that. I don't know how long that upset lasted for. I don't know how upset she was. But I remember hearing Sophie's not exactly thrilled. But it's. I think one has to realise that if you're complicit in image making, if you're doing something with somebody, then you trust them. I think see it in the same way that you would do if you're working with a painter, that they will have the liberty to portray you how they see you. And now with image making as opposed to photography, you have the total liberty to portray somebody in whatever way you see them. And that's in fact why you go to an artist, because you want to know how Lucian Freud sees you, or how David Hockney, or how Tracy Emin sees you, or whatever it is. It's the same thing if you go to somebody who uses image making. They have as much freedom to form you in in how they see you. That's what you want from them.
And tell me, this is a boring technical question, but what did you use to, in the Lee image, what's he contrasted with? Was it just someone throwing red in the exploding head one?
Oh no, the exploding head one is we looked at the film Scanners. Do you know Scanners? It's a horror film from the 70s or 80s, I can't remember, I'm afraid. And this famous scene in Scanners, in fact I think the only scene anybody remembers from Scanners, is where the guy's head blew up.
Because Lee did a show called Scanners.
Did he? Well, there you go, that's probably the link. And in the cinema trade, to get the most lifelike gore, you use watermelon, peeled tomatoes, and KY jelly.
So you put them in a pot?
Yes.
And then
that's what guts and brains and things when they explode. It's watermelon.
Yeah, they do that if someone's throwing up.
And KY jelly.
Cold vegetable soup.
Is it?
Yeah.
Right. What's all these little tricks?
Well,
So that's what's sort of coming out of Lee's head.
And tell me about revisiting those images now, because I find, and don't take this the wrong way, there's something quite quaint about looking at them now, particularly because I've seen so much of your work and I see the amazing post-production you do now, and you look at them and you imagine how different they'd look if you'd made them now. I think that's, and there's something they're so of their time, and is that quite interesting to look at your work? And
I don't go back and look at them much, it's the truth. So I don't spend that time looking at my old work. So I don't really sort of spend a lot of time analysing my old work. I guess I don't really see them in that way, because they're just part of an ongoing sort of journey through my work and a journey through, trying to understand about the world and working with people.
And technologies as well.
Technology and what you could do. So I don't have that detachment from them.
Sure.
To look at them in that way. But sure, if I did them now, they'd be different.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Pleasure.